Welcome back to Capital Conversations. I'm Marty Owens, and we're pleased now to welcome Professor David Schultz, who teaches at the Law Department at Hamline University. I think some other departments as well, criminology.
Public administration and law.
Okay, public administration and law, and also he's the author of several books, including before your most recent book, American Politics in the Age of Ignorance, Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Research, and then Politainment, the 10 Rules of Contemporary Politics,
Yes.
A Citizen's Guide to Understanding Campaigns and Elections. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. So we're happy to have you on the program tonight. Thanks for joining us, Professor Schultz.
I'm happy to be here.
Glad to have you. So, hey, I was looking at your new book, and you write a lot of interesting things about the disconnect between what's reality and what actually lawmakers end up talking about, debating, and turning into law.
Yeah, what I'm really interested in is a basic problem, is about why lawmakers repeatedly enact public policies that are known to have failed, and then to put together a catalog of sort of my David Letterman top 10 list of the most frequently repeated political myths or failures.
Yes.
So that's really the issue here. It's a gap between what we know from research and from experimentation about what works and what doesn't work, versus, again, what legislators debate and what they do, and oftentimes they ignore all that research.
Well, let's get right to that. Let's talk about it a little bit. Tax incentives are a good way to affect business relocation decisions, something you hear a lot from Republicans or people on the right. What did you find out?
Okay, what it is again, for a lot of this research here, this is not just my research, this is a cataloging of like all these points here of hundreds and hundreds of studies. I mean, for example, we hear when it comes to taxes, we hear the argument that says that taxes, for example, are a great way to encourage businesses to relocate into a community or something like that. The best evidence, and this is one where we have overwhelming evidence, is that taxes are about 4th or 5th or 6th on the list in terms of factors that affect business location decisions. The single most important factor determining whether a business is going to locate in a community, it's the workforce. It's the quality of the workforce. Then you get down to things such as access to markets, access to suppliers, you get down to energy costs, transportation, then you get down to something like taxes. And so what we have is taxes really have a very small, I'm not saying no role, but a very small role in terms of influencing business location decisions. Yet instead what we see is repeatedly local governments, state governments enacting billions and billions of dollars of tax cuts every year and incentives to try to lure businesses in, when in fact we would be much better off.
Yeah.
We would be much better off if we really wanted to encourage business development in the state, taking that money and putting it into workforce training and into educational programs. That'll have the biggest bang for the biggest buck.
And your research supports the research you collected supports the idea that that it sounds like states that are like Minnesota, that are in the tradition of sort of growing their, I would say, for lack of a better word, they invest in the people, the education systems, the infrastructure it takes to get, are largely better than the states like Mississippi that invest a lot less in things like that.
There's no question.
It's unfair maybe to compare Mississippi to Minnesota, but
but it's an apt analogy there. If taxes were the single determinant of how well a state would do, then states like Mississippi and Alabama would be thriving, and states like Minnesota, would be in the tank. When in fact, you caught it exactly correct, is that the investments in education, in infrastructure, in the quality of life things clearly make a far bigger difference in terms of helping states. And part of what Minnesota has had, going back to the 1970s, if not earlier, has been this commitment to investments in education that really have panned off in terms of the fact that we have one of the more robust economies in the United States, some of the best paid workers, some of the best trained workers. We do very, very well in this state, and that's where the debate should be. And that's partly what's interesting about the governor's budget proposal, if I can sort of tie it in here, is what the governor is really trying to do, I've noticed here, and what little details I can put together here, is to really say that what we need to do is invest more in K through 12, higher ed, and in early childhood education, in the sense, that's where he's put a lot of his budget increases, in the sense of saying that investing in workforces, work in people, that will better help the state down the line than doing other types of things.
So it's hearkening back to the Minnesota Miracle days, where this sort of idea that investing in the people could make a difference in the economic engine of the state. So yes, right, I understand. It sounds like the governor, he wants to be ambitious like that, and yet I see some of the ideas are recycled, certainly not new, and it didn't seem overly innovative to be critical of the governor's budget.
In this situation, it's a recycling of ideas, but not a bad recycling of ideas.
Okay.
In the sense of saying that we're going to go back to either it's the Minnesota Miracle, or I think I talk about this book and said that, Rudy Purwich, when he talked about, Governor Purwich said he wants to make Minnesota the brain power state.
Right.
That's what I sort of think that Mark Dayton, if I can say that, is stealing from. This idea of going back to a Purwich set of priorities in terms of where he wants to take the state.
Let's go down to kind of where we've seen the debate take form in the last few years. If you boil it down to its most basic terms, to most people on the street who follow politics casually, casualty is probably a better. You're a casualty if you do follow, but casually follow politics. It seems like an argument between those that are advocating for the less fortunate, the poor, those people that are maybe middle class or less well off, and those advocating for business, and those, as an engine to grow or whatever, and those who may be more wealthy. And they call that, some have sat here in these chairs and called that class warfare. What's your take on that?
A couple things. First, it's clearly a philosophical disagreement regarding where we want to take the government. And that's at one level. In terms of, again, if we have finite amount of resources, how do we want to allocate those resources? It's also a question about who does government advocate for? Does it advocate for one spectrum of the population or a different spectrum? So we've seen two different parties representing different constituencies trying to offer contrasting visions. But on another level, what we can also argue is that you hope that somewhere beneath those partisan differences, there's some shared commitments.
Right.
We're hoping ultimately in the end that both parties are saying they care about everybody succeeding. They're hoping that every kid, does well and gets a good, wants to go to college or gets a good job or something like that. And so what we need to be thinking about is if we do share certain types of goals in terms of what we're going to do, what's the best means? What are the best types of public policies to get there? And I think we make that we confuse some things. We confuse sometimes the debate over philosophy, which is legitimate to have, but we sometimes have shared philosophies, but vastly different ways of thinking about how to get to the same point. And again, what my book is about is saying that, again, we have pretty good evidence, pretty good information regarding what policies will get us in certain directions versus what don't. I'm certainly not claiming that we know everything, which we don't, but we can say that we have good ideas about what won't work, and we have good ideas about what will work. And in our private lives, aren't all of us taught in our private lives to make decisions based upon the best evidence at hand?
Yeah,
that's what this book is about.
Well, that and the research. I want to talk about, your book hasn't been out a real long time yet, but what, and to be fair, I want to bring this up. What kind of criticisms is it receiving? Who's panning it? Who's poking the holes in your research? What are they saying?
Well, I think where the holes can get poked in it will be to argue that I glide over details too quickly. And there is a sense in which there's a little bit of glibness to the book, and a little bit of sense in terms of saying that, that the research is conclusive in some areas. And some people might say, well, it's not so conclusive. I mean, for example,
they could argue the subtleties in a statistic.
Subtleties. For example, one of the topics that I talk about here is all about sort of stadium politics.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up.
We repeatedly see legislators, governors, including the governor in the state, mayors, wanting to say, let's put lots of money into public subsidies for stadiums as an engine for economic development. Well, the research is overwhelming that for the most part, stadium investments are a horrible, horrible means.
Why doesn't that surprise me?
It's a horrible tool for economic development. Awful in terms of cost per job, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there may be one or two projects out there that have actually worked, but as I like to describe it, there's this phrase that says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. I want to argue that the definition of political insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And rarely do we find situations where investments in sports, public subsidies for sports, pan out to be a good deal for the state. And so that's what I want to sort of say here, is that somebody will come back and say to me, well, what about this project in that state? Okay, maybe that one has worked, but in general, they don't work. And that's where I get my criticism.
Well, that's what I want to ask you before we run out of time here, is the United States government and local government used to be involved in grand public works projects
Right.
as a way to express me. Like today, you sit in a building that was built by people you know who cared about government.
Right.
And you're overwhelmed by that when
Right.
you walk in this building. You can tell. They didn't skimp on the marble down
That's
there.
right.
And but this was a public building for the people.
Yeah.
Whereas opposed to the structures we're putting up now, the money we're investing in these stadiums, it's really for the people who can afford the tickets. It's a whole different class of folks that can go to a ball game and watch a football game. I tend to think, unless you're a middle income person who wants to save up money to go, and parking's of
Yeah.
$50. What happened to that? Where did we sort of fall off from the grand public works and the infrastructure investment into or funding billionaires to build their stadiums?
Well, it's really
in your
started.
opinion?
Yeah, it's
And
really
I don't mean to be glib, but
Sure, yeah. Well, I agree with you. The Capitol we're in, this is the people's building. The stadiums are not the people's buildings. I mean, I've seen numbers that say that the average family of four is going to spend several $100s to go to a football game. That's not a people's building. When it started to happen, I would say, or reoccurred, it started about 35 years ago in terms of our pulling back of our commitments from investing in the future. Part of what we've done, I would argue, for the last 30 to 40 years is we've been greedy. Our parents, our grandparents built, our great-grandparents built these wonderful structures. They built parks. They built all these public infrastructures, and we have milked them. And therefore, now we need to reinvest in them, and we're not. And what are we going to pass on to our children? We're not going to pass on the same legacy that our parents and grandparents passed on to us. And that's just being greedy at this point. And so it's really been this shift that's occurred about in the last 30 years in terms of saying that we're not going to invest in that direction. And part of why we've done that, I would argue, is because of the role of money in politics, of special interests that have really sort of captured the government in terms of pulling it to favor particular interests as opposed to the public interest.
Well, let's get right to that point. Has America become too capitalist oriented? Are we focusing too much on capitalism and not enough on governance and as a mechanism to improve people's lives?
Markets can do some things very well.
Right.
I think markets are a great way to allocate sailboats. They're a great way to allocate luxury cars. But markets are not the way to govern. Markets are not the way of pursuing the public good.
And yet they influence so much of policy today.
They do. I mean, we should have free markets where they're appropriate, but not free markets when it comes to things such as governance, not when it comes to such things such as healthcare, not when it comes to such things as making choices in terms of how our political system should operate. The way I would describe it is that the resources that people amass in the economic marketplace should not privilege them in the political marketplace. There should be walls of separation. And those walls have collapsed, and therefore we don't have one person, one vote. We have $1, one vote.
Yeah, and Americans look at these people, I would argue some Americans, and believe that's the picture of success, and therefore they listen to these themes about, if you're rich, then you must be better than me.
Yeah, and that's
what a self-defeating way to live your life in a way.
It is. That's a
Sad.
deep-seated belief in American culture that somehow that being wealthy is a sign of some type of moral virtue.
Right.
And I'm not saying that it isn't, but clearly for people who are born destitute, people who are born poor, people who are immigrants coming to this country, they deserve a chance too. They deserve an opportunity, and we're creating a culture, and we have good evidence that supports that. We have the greatest economic inequalities in the United States now in 80 years. Our social mobility, the ability to hit that home run and go from being poor to being rich, has almost evaporated at this point. We have created a static, immobile society that makes it impossible for people to succeed. And part of what we need to be having at this point is a serious discussion about how do we capture those
that
the
seems
dreams.
downright unfair and un-American, actually.
It is un-American. It is unfair.
Yeah. Well, the book is American Politics in the Age of Ignorance. And I before we wrap up, we're kind of running a little over here, but are we really, I mean, you've got a lot of arguments to support your case, but are we in an age of ignorance right now in terms of our political life?
I think we are. And the focus here is on what public officials don't know. But clearly, I think as a culture, we seem to be in some ways less well informed than we were before. We have a point where we now have Republicans have their television, Fox. We have the Democrats have their television, MSNBC. Nobody talks to one another. Everybody seems to have their own version of the truth at this point.
They want it reinforced.
And they want it reinforced. Nobody wants that. And you go to school and people don't want to confront things that are different from what they've already thought about. And what we really need to do is create a culture that's much more critical and much more willing to raise questions. I'm not going to get into a debate in terms of saying what facts that we need to know. We need to be more critical in how we think about democracy.
Precisely. And you can help yourself be critical of that by reading American Politics in the Age of Ignorance and Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Racism. And you can also find out about more about Professor Schultz's writings at, and I believe it's schultzestake.blogspot.com where you blog.
Correct.
Right. And where can people find the book, Professor Schultz?
It's going to be at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, all the major places.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, look for it on bookstores near you, or go to Amazon. You can find it right now today. That's all we have time for tonight, Professor Schultz. I really appreciate you coming on the program.
You're welcome.
Talking to the folks out there about this. Don't forget to tune in a few minutes when we'll have Paul Demko from Politics in Minnesota on just to talk about the governor's budget briefly. And then next week we'll have House Majority Leader Aaron Murphy and Republican House Member Steve Drazkowski, who will join the program. Plus our political panel returns with Sarah Janicek, Mitch Berg, and reporter Brianna Birschbach from Politics in Minnesota. They'll break down all the early session action and maybe even give us a few predictions. We'd like to thank our guest, Representative Mike Nelson, a Democrat in the House, and also former Representative Republican Mark Biskins. Also, I'd like to thank Professor David Schultz for joining us. Don't forget to find us on Twitter at MNCapNews, and I'll make a revision right now on the fly to our program. Paul Demko can be seen in our Capitol Update, not in the next segment. So tune in to our Capitol Update and you'll see Paul Demko. Also, for more political news and analysis, tune in to KFAI Radio. That's 90.3 every Wednesday morning at 7:40 for the Capitol briefing, and that's on the Morning Blend program with Dale Connolly. Or check us out at mncapitalnews.com, and we can catch up on all the political news of the day. We had production assistance from Cliff Dahlberg. Our executive producer is Catherine Laudenslager. And for my co-host, Paul Gardner, who couldn't be here tonight, I'm Marty Owings. So long. We'll see you at the Capitol.